Today I actually wanted to talk about two, or should I say three, of my favorite directors doing a somewhat similar setup with the whole evil, unhinged husband wants to take care of potentially unfaithful wife in a bloodshedding sort of way. And naturally that brings us to not just an Alfred Hitchcock movie, but the very first movie that the Coen brothers made, um, as far as being writers, producers, and directors, as they came to be through their whole, like, the same process throughout this movie is what they've stuck with all along, all the way down to the fake name for themselves as the editors, and down to that style of only showing the names of the actors in the opening credits and then waiting for the rest. And it's really one of those kind of rare debuts to where it's like you can spend most of the movie looking for what you would see in their later movies as well. It wasn't just like some starting point to say, well, this is what we got, but don't worry, we're going to get better. They came in and said, this is what we're going to do. And as of now, they have completely and totally stuck to it. Taking some interesting directions here and there. I'm still not the biggest fan of Hail Caesar, especially when you look at the rest of it, but yeah. And obviously, one of Hitchcock's more famous ones, at least the title, is one of his most famous titles. But I actually want to, I was pretty much already heading in that direction. So obviously I want to start with Blood Simple. And I was talking about the fact that, yeah, you kind of, I mean, obviously you want to appreciate it for being the starting point in its own thing, and they hadn't done anything else up to this point. But you kind of can't help yourself. You want to just kind of see those things that you know you're going to see later in their career, and that hits you immediately with the opening, where it's just random shots of landscapes in Texas while somebody narrates. And you think, oh yeah, this is exactly the opening to No Country for Old Men. The narrator is coming from a completely different perspective and saying completely different things, but you just get that sense immediately that this was going to be something that continued on throughout their whole career. And as it goes on, as it starts immediately, even during our opening credit sequence, it kind of gives you this. We get kind of double doses here in regards to eras, because obviously it came out in 1984, I want to say. So it's going to have, obviously they're going for a noir thing, which they do very well. As I've said many times before, a lot of people try the noir thing, and it doesn't always work out to that effect. But this very much, you can pretty much change the setting of this movie to back to, like, make everything coherent with the 40s and turn it black and white, and you would get a very similar, albeit very bloody and graphic for the time, movie that very much feels like it fits in that era. But then at the same time you have some of these little touches, particularly Burwell's score, another thing that would be very continuous throughout their career, that has more of like an 80s Doom kind of feel, and it's crazy how well those two things mesh. It's like you would think one would kind of contradict the other, but no, they just kind of flow very well together, and it still kind of has that whole classic noir feel to it, even if it felt also in ways of the time it actually came out as well. And when you look at this plot, you'll notice that typically Coen Brothers movies are filled with really dumb people doing really stupid things, that end up causing some serious crime and serious bloodshed. And that's, you can sense that here. The characters in this movie are significantly smarter than some of the later Coen Brothers characters, but we do kind of get that vibe with, obviously Dana Day's character, Marty, is the one that sets this whole thing off by hiring Emma Walsh to kill them, or at least watch them and then kill them all in the first place. And when we meet him, and the fact that we know this is where the story's going, you kind of get the sense of, well, this will probably just be some jackass that thinks he's tougher than he is, and all that. But yeah, as we meet him, he does become, like, we realize he is legitimately threatening, and he is, like, even when he's not even in the movie anymore, he still just casts this shadow, especially over McDormand, There's just something so sinister about him, and we don't really know where any of the characters in this movie really come from. It's like we're dropped in the middle of it as it's happening, but in a good and effective way, to where it kind of... And we really, really have to work by ourselves to put the pieces together, which makes it much more rewarding in the long run. But yeah, there are these moments, like, when he's talking about the fact... When he just... first off, he just has that stare, like that glare, even when he's in a room by himself. He just looks kind of threatening. Even if he's not particularly physically imposing. And he has a weak-ass stomach. But there's still definitely something here, especially that moment when Emma Walsh seems like he's kind of piecing together that maybe this isn't all coming together, and then he tells him the bad news, basically. And Marty basically threatens him by saying, back in the old times in Greece, they used to cut the head off of the messengers that gave bad news. And it's like, we totally believe that's a legitimate threat and not somebody just kind of like grandstanding to look, more threatening than they are. But the genius thing about them pulling that off is that we learn that Marty is not the character we need to look out for. He is by no means the most dangerous character in the story. That, of course, is the only man that made the poster and the DVD cover. And this character we have with Emma Walsh being the real threat is that we do get a sense that obviously he's a bit threatening. Maybe not if you've seen Lebowski as many times as everybody has, when it was John Polito just kind of following them around, almost in a bumbling sort of way. But we do get a sense immediately, those opening scenes when he's following them are certainly by no means played for comedy, or even dark comedy. But still, we never quite know exactly the lengths this guy's willing to go, or how shady he really is, until we watch the character progress. And you notice when we have scenes like, even when they plot the murder, when they're just sitting in the car, and Walsh just has this really kind of friendly, talkative southern dude way about him. Basically the character he would play in Racing Arizona a few years later for them. The dude that would just stand around the factory and just talk to Cage endlessly. And he has that vibe to him, but then it's like, once you realize what it is, it's like, we should have known. And the people in the movie should have known. Where it's like, if this guy, the friendlier he acts, while also being that willing to kill people for money, that's when you realize you should probably watch your back. Because if he can come off that friendly, that particular scene, that particular moment actually, when he says, I want you to do something for me, and he's like, well, if it pays well and it's legal, and he's like, well, it's not really legal, and he's like, well, if it pays well, and it's just that quick. He drops the, forget it doesn't have to be legal thing. And he agrees to this murder almost instantly, and it's like, that should have been the whole spelling. That's probably where you come out and say, wow, Marty was kind of a dumbass in true Coen Brothers fashion. Getting way too far over his head when he has no idea what he's really getting into. And so that's definitely one of the more interesting aspects of the movie, is watching his character seem like one thing but become another when we kick ourselves for not realizing we should have known all along that no fucking buddy should have hired this guy or trusted this guy or done anything like that. And now they're all going to pay the fucking price for it terribly. And then going on the plot with McDormand and John Getz, their little affair that sets this off that we're apparently seeing from the beginning. I said it felt like we were dropped in the middle of it, but by the dialogue we kind of were able to piece together that apparently this was the very start of it. Because apparently she had no idea that he liked her. This is just a scene of him giving her a ride because it's raining. And it all just happens very quickly. And what's interesting about them doing this when they're taking the noir approach is that a lot of what comes out of film noir movies is the sexual tension between the male lead and the female lead. And there's always that, are they going to or are they not going to thing. This movie has no interest in dealing with that. They jump right to it. they're in bed like seconds after the opening credits are over. And they just put a stop to that immediately, which of course this is going to set the whole plot off, but it also kind of does that, but without taking the actual tension out of it, because there is the later scene when they're in the separate rooms. And it's like, even though we already know they've gotten to that point, there's still that kind of tension there where we're kind of waiting for them to reunite, again, for lack of a less weird way to put it. And also the way they interact after the shit starts to go down. And this is the point in the movie where it could have gotten really convoluted really easily, but then this is where we're able to see just how much of a gift they had for storytelling this early. When we get to the case of Marty has been killed by, or pretty much killed by Emmett Walsh's character, but of course, John Getz is under the impression that McDormand did it. And McDormand doesn't think anything's happened. She has no idea. And so when we get to this point to where John Getz thinks he knows what's happened, and she has no idea that Marty's even been shot, let alone buried alive, the dialogue that takes place here is so incredibly specific, because they play it up to where there's no particular time, even though they're both on totally different planets when they're talking. There's no real dialogue that slips out that should be a dead giveaway to the other character. And it's like, that has to be such a hard scene to write. To make it not seem like there's just one thing keeping this from happening. It's like, the more they talk, and the more they're coming from those different directions, the dialogue still meshes together and makes this scene flow, with no information getting to the other person. It's crazy that they can do that. What was it? And it's just, when you look at the events of the movie itself, Roger Ebert said something about this movie, and the Coen brothers in general, when they do movies like this, and it was, the Coen brothers build crazy walls with sensible bricks. And it's like, wow, that's perfect, actually. Because, yeah, surprisingly, once again, in lesser movies, even in movies that ultimately succeed, there's going to be some convoluted qualities that slip through the cracks. But in these particular scenes where it seems like it absolutely is definitely the place that would happen, they're able to slowly kind of go around it, and they are able to make the scene work in this fashion, and that can't be commended enough. And then, obviously, going on, from the technical aspect, like I said, there was a lot of stuff we'd recognize. There's their editing. They have a co-editor in this case. And yeah, as far as the editing goes, I don't think it's the movie's strongest asset, but there are definitely scenes where it stands out. Like, I like the fact that they use the white transition. That feels nice and old-fashioned, especially for a movie that's kind of going for an old-fashioned route like this. And then there's the more flashy stuff, which is still cool, like when Maurice goes to press the button on his answering machine, and it dissolves right into Ray touching the blood in the car. But then there's stuff like, sometimes the way scenes are put together doesn't always work. There's one little section of this movie that just gets me all messed up every time I watch it, which is, it's a normal scene. I think it's like an Emmett Walsh scene, and then it cuts to Frances McDormand in the apartment with the landlady who's screaming, and then it like before this scene has anything to do with anything, they immediately cut to her at the bar talking to Maurice, and then just before that scene seems like it's going to go somewhere, it immediately cuts to a different one. It's like, that little section just seems so... Are we getting any useful information out? And it's like, yeah, these are little seeds that are being planted a little bit to make scenes later, like, make more sense than I guess they would without these moments, but it's like, they just sped through this so quickly, it's kind of disorienting, and it almost looks like pieces of the movie are missing or something. But it still does come together nicely. The scenes, I guess, don't say any less than they have to, or more than they have to, or whatever. But, yeah, it's that section there just always kind of jars me when I see it, but overall it's fine. But cinematographer is Barry Sonnenfeld once again, who would do some of his best work a few years later with them when he shot Raising Arizona for them. And there's even one of my favorite shots in Raising Arizona during the Blown Back Earth Apocalypse scene, when we have that giant zoom in that goes all the way like up the ladder and through the window and in the bedroom and all that at the Arizona house. He uses that zoom again here when, after Marty has broken into the house and takes her outside, and we zoom up the yard and back up to them. So I like those little techniques that he does. Obviously extremely flashy, not particularly subtle. But a lot of the technical aspects in this movie kind of aren't, but that's kind of just comes with the territory with your first movie, where you really come in wanting to make an impression. And you're going to have flashy stuff like that, up to the editing as well. But there's still plenty of great maneuvering that's, well, I wouldn't necessarily say subtle, definitely not flashy to a fault. So they definitely have that going for them, and yeah, there are moments where it's like that sense of humor you're kind of looking for. When we have the dead end scene, when we've had this big confrontation with Marty that ultimately could have ended in death. Like, this got really intense, and then they punctuate it with the moment when Marty drives down the road, realizes there's a dead end, has to drive the other way. It's like, yeah, this is the kind of thing that would probably happen in one of their comedies, but they seem to really kind of dial it down, the kind of humor they would do in their more serious movies when they do stuff like this, to where the comedy's a lot more downplayed and maybe not as something as, you know, big and comedic as this whole segment of Marty going from one end to the other. But yeah, and they do another thing that I guess you would say, I guess this is in the direction if you want to go back to the technical aspects, where the stuff, those little cues, like when Marty is sitting outside and he's trying to, they're basically confronting each other, he and Ray, about this situation. And you can just sense, you know, Marty's boiling rage as he's sitting outside. You can kind of get that from the fire from the incinerator, and then this bug zapper that's next to him. And this scene kind of builds and builds, and then it's finally when Marty snaps that the bug zapper just starts going crazy next to him. Once again, it doesn't have to be subtle. It doesn't have to be. And that's a good enough effect to really show the fact that Marty's pretty much at the absolute edge at this point, and that flaming rage is definitely inside him and will be coming out in the most dangerous ways possible. But then they also have those moments that are a bit small in building their suspense, like the use of the dog, when it's like, it kind of takes a second to register, just like it does for McDormand. When she's at Ray's place, and she's just doing her thing before she realizes that the dog is there. And then it's like, oh, wait a minute, that's Marty's dog. What is she doing here? And then before we can, just as we put the pieces together, he attacks. So I thought that was a really good use of that. And obviously the direction in general, and this kind of goes back to what Sonnenfeld's bringing to the table as well, like that shot over the bar where we like go over the sleeping guy's head. And the really great shot of, once again, a little bit obvious, but when McDormand is in the window, and then we've cut back out there multiple times to see there's nobody out there, even though there's supposed to be the feel that they are being watched. But then suddenly, McDormand goes out of the frame, and behind her, through this somewhat lengthy shot, was Walsh's car sitting there. So that's always a nice, effective shot. And also, as far as like sound goes, I love the fact that this movie builds up so much that violent things are going to occur, and there's just that kind of ongoing dread where it's like, you know somebody's going to get fucked up. You just don't know how or when. And we're just kind of waiting for it and waiting for it and waiting for it. And the first big moment in the movie doesn't come until he shoots Marty. Walsh shoots Marty. And when he does, I love the fact that the gunshot is so fucking loud. to where like it really just breaks through and says this is where the shit has hit the fan, and it's like a whole big turning point that comes to absolute fireworks. So I always thought that was really well used as well. And once again, talking about what the Coen brothers have brought before, the colorful side characters are going to be here. They are either they're supporting characters or they're just one-off characters, like the screaming landlady. It feels very much like that. And then yeah, there's like Maurice, where it's like he kind of struts across the bar to go over and change the jukebox. He's played by Sam R. Williams. I assume that anybody that's been a fan of Fresh Prince knows his name, because you might see it a lot. In almost every episode of Fresh Prince, you will see him credited as a writer or a producer. It's like, yeah, when you see that name on Fresh Prince, Maurice and Blood Simple. Is that not fucking random as hell? But regardless, there are... it's not to say, obviously, that it's flawless, obviously. But I will say, obviously, a great way to look at it also is just how much it builds, because when people do their first movie, you can kind of tell, maybe not so much nowadays, because first-timers are getting a bit more artsy, at least the ones that, you know, come into mainstream attention more or less. But a lot of first-timers want to basically get to the action. They want to kind of, like I said, make that impression, but they do it in a way that's maybe a bit overzealous. And they like really, really take their time with this. They really let it build and let it get to that point. Almost like you might say a Hitchcock influence, with how much they build it before finally it all starts to really break loose. But once again, there are some problems if you want to talk about that. We've got, every now and then there's some questionable dialogue. It's like, yeah, even the Coen brothers had questionable dialogue when they first started. The one in particular that stands out to me is when that scene where Marty shows up and it's like he's about to kill her at Ray's place, and he says, why don't we do it outside, in nature? It's like, that line always kind of seemed weird to me, and it's like, that didn't really seem like something he would say, and it's kind of a weird way to put it, but okay, if that's what he wants to do. I feel like we missed something there, but yeah, it's just a few lines like that where you say, I don't know about that. Like I said, even the Coen brothers can have that. Everybody does at some point. And then there is stuff like, where sometimes after a while it's like it's trying to turn into a horror movie, which I suppose I get, because it's kind of, it was somewhat of a starting point, because obviously Joel Coen was one of Raimi's editors on Evil Dead. So it's like, I suppose if he kind of just came from horror, like not long after they made this, I can kind of get a transition there, kind of like, there's a lot of like jump scenes after a while, especially in the second half. The whole newspaper thing, I don't really know what the point of that is. It is kind of a cool effect, you can see it coming from like a mile away, but even so, it just seems more like a cheap jump thing than anything else. And then there is the nightmare that McDormand has about Marty coming back, and then like the puking blood, and it's like, that just kind of felt out of place. Where it's kind of like, Joel Coen, you do realize you're no longer involved in the making of Evil Dead, right? You're making a crime noir type movie. So stuff like that kind of feels out of place, but overall, obviously it's an extremely strong debut. Immediately got everyone's attention on them, and they went on to follow it up with one of my personal favorites of theirs, Raising Arizona, and yeah, following it up with Miller's Crossing, Barton Fink, Hudsucker Proxy, and so on. We know the history. And like I said, you could see it from the get-go. Like, this is one of those rare cases where you can look back at the first movie and you could say, oh yeah, they just spelled it out from the get-go. But even regardless of that, they still constantly surprise us. Like, every time. In one way or another, they find a way to surprise us, despite the fact that we feel like we really know them and there's always going to be a familiarity with their movies, but the fact that they still manage to put those twists in it that we never see coming is always very satisfying and fun to watch. So to put to put it mildly. That's like the most honest anything I've ever said about the Coen brothers. Like, yeah, they're fun to watch. It's like, no, they've only made, what, 3 masterpieces with Fargo and Barton Fink, No Country for Old Men, and if you ask me, Raising Arizona. But yeah, that's a lot of... I know people like to throw around the word masterpiece, but I mean seriously, those 4 movies I legitimately consider flawless, and I know this because I've seen them fucking 100 times each. So, yes. So, yes, that was our introduction to them. I really need to get the Criterion DVD. This is just the regular one that does have that weird intro, where they talk about how they, like, revamped it a little bit, and the guy says, like, we've now revamped it into the greatest movie ever, or something. It's a very Coen Brothers intro. But yes, before we drag this on, let's go on to Dial M for Murder. I haven't talked about Hitchcock near as much as I would have liked to, but I'm sure we'll change that in the long run. They've got that Fathom screening of Vertigo coming in a couple months. I will definitely be attending for sure. But in the meantime, we have Dial M for Murder, once again, a very similar setup with the whole Ray Milland wanting to set up the murder of Grace Kelly because she may or may not be being unfaithful to him. And I love the fact that he's able to set this up, like, immediately in the first minute of the movie, like, the first 60 seconds of the movie, with, like, no dialogue. He sets this up. Because we've got the 2 of them, Milland and Kelly, at, like, a lunch table or a dinner table. And they're not really looking at each other. He accidentally knocks the salt over, and he throws it over, and it's like, so we know he's superstitious, and it's like, if he's superstitious, there's a good chance he's also kind of predictable. And they both just kind of look dead inside with each other. But then we have this moment when she sees that the ship has come in the paper, and we see a light in her eyes suddenly that we do not see when she's with her husband. And then dissolve, she's kissing another dude. And then we go from there. And I love the fact that they pretty much introduce the whole setup of this movie just in that wordless 60 seconds. In a movie that is so incredibly dialogue heavy. It's based on a play. Of course it's going to be dialogue heavy. But in 60 seconds with no sound at the very start, we have all the setup we need. And that's brilliant. And the most interesting thing I've always found to be about Dial M for Murder is I was just talking about the fact that Hitchcock's movies always have the really long build-up. Most of them do. A lot of his really famous ones as well. Have those big, giant enders where, and it's not necessarily always story-driven. Like, scenes with her and Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window. And, like I said, they do add definitely to the character for sure, and they really do build that up so it doesn't feel like we're just jumping right into the suspense, which is going to make the suspense so much better when we actually get to it. This kind of works like a Hitchcock movie in reverse, because Dial M for Murder gets straight to the point and then saves the second half for building tension, because what we have here is, it's maybe barely 20 minutes in, which for a Hitchcock movie is like really fast-paced. Like the first 20 minutes in, we are introduced to Anthony Dawson's character, the guy that is being hired to kill her. And there's hardly any setup. The interesting thing about this is a lot is said about Milland's character and his intentions in this scene just by the way he casually interacts with Dawson's character, because he's obviously knows a lot more about him than Dawson does about him. And he remembers these things about him, like these small details, and it's like, okay, and Dawson just, shrugs it off and says, wow, you have a much better memory than I do. But it's like, you hear this and you know his plan, and it's like, does he just have a really good memory, or is there something way sinister about not just what his obvious intentions to be are, but just the fact that he knows so much about this dude that hardly knows who he is. He knows him because of tennis. And it's like, as far as like attending the same school, it's like he knows everything about him. And that in itself kind of gives you this whole sinister intent before it really goes into what he's planning in the first place. So, I always thought that was really effective, and there's obviously a lot of these, once again, because it's based on a play, we're going to be in this one location a lot, and have just these characters talking back and forth. And you'll notice they're obviously not to the same extent by any means, but there are a lack of cuts that kind of bring us back to Rope, which I believe was 6 years before this, somewhere in that area. Um, and it's not necessarily just that, but also, yeah, he will sometimes use kind of camera movements and techniques to kind of liven the scene up a little bit, even if it's just two dudes talking. But in a way that's not extremely flashy. Like, obviously Hitchcock knew that he didn't have to do a shitload. He made Rope. He knew he didn't have to do a shitload when just two guys are talking to make it seem, make the whole picture seem alive. But there are these moments where he'll just move the camera in just the right way, or in a way that you do take notice of. It doesn't take you out of it. But like when the lamp's between them, for an example, when they're both sitting down, and then Milan stands up, but the camera has made it a point to move here where the lamp is between them, but then when Milan stands up, he's like perfectly aligned with the lamp almost. And it's like it's always kind of constantly moving. Milan is constantly standing up and sitting back down. He's holding that cane that he doesn't need and walking on it. There's so much in this scene that kind of grabs your attention, but doesn't take the focus away from the dialogue where we're watching all of this unfold. And it's kind of only when you step back and you're looking at it you realize just kind of how alive the frames are, even though it seems like a bit of a mundane scene, regardless of what's being discussed in them. And so yeah, obviously I always love that kind of stuff, especially in Hitchcock's hands. I do think it's maybe not always necessary, like the moment when it cuts back to Dawson, but instead of just cutting back to him, it like starts from this side of the couch with just his drinking shot and then pans over to him. When he's not even talking, like he's not even the real focus of this moment, but yeah, it does just kind of give, the look at the picture itself a bit of a life, and kind of has your attention in this kind of hypnotizing way that you may or may not even notice when you're watching it. So, yeah, we must not question what Hitchcock does. Maybe back when in his more silent era, like Easy Virtue and Jamaica Inn and all them, The Ring, Champagne. I did like Champagne quite a bit, but there's, yeah, though, for the most part, yeah, it does feel like it all has a purpose in regards to kind of bringing the story to life in a way and making it not just be... I do sense a bit of a fear of making it seem like, oh, we just filmed a play. The criticism most movies like this get. But it does work for the most part. It doesn't feel like it's taking away from the story itself. And then, and like I said, there is also... Obviously, we have a very strong cast with 2 Oscar winners at the front of it. I also really like what Anthony Dawson brings here. I knew him, obviously, I think most people do, because of, obviously he was Professor Dent in Dr. No, the Tarantula dude, and then going on Dr. No, he went on to play an unseen Blofeld in a few of the following Bond movies there. I think From Russia with Love was one of them. So, and then this is actually the first thing I think of, though, much as I grew up on Bond. And, yeah, there's also kind of a sinister quality to him, where once again, it's kind of like we talked about with Walsh in Blood Simple, where it's like, he seemed a little too quick to agree to murder. It's like, oh, what is this crazy plan? It's like, I got money, dude. And it's like, well, alright. So, and the thing here also is that, playing on these sinister qualities, we have the scene that's particularly creepy without drawing any attention to itself, when he's had the plan laid out to him, and then Milan's gonna call Grace Kelly up and talk to her, and while she's right here on the phone, Dawson's walking around the apartment, kind of figuring out the layout so he knows how to do this. He's turning the fucking lights out, he's looking through shit, and it's like, to think this is being plotted while she might as well be right here. If he does one thing that makes any slight sound that goes over that phone, she's gonna hear her own murder being plotted. And it's like, there's just something so creepy about that I love. Like I said, it doesn't draw attention to itself when it does it. So, yes. And another thing that's interesting to look at when you look at Dial M for Murder is its placement in Hitchcock's filmography. Because you could say that it kind of has a similar structure to Psycho in the sense that it gets to a point and we feel like the story is going in a certain direction. It basically tells us this is where the story is going, and then a murder happens in the middle of it and completely changes the game, and then we just have to see where the hell it's going to go once that happens. And despite the fact that this predates Psycho by about 6 years, and it did kind of have that way about it also, to where it's like that the murder scene really is kind of brutal for the era that it's in. And it's not even so much that he gets stabbed in the back with scissors. The shot they do not shy away from when he falls back on them. And it's like, for the 50s, that was insanely graphic. Much like people say about the shower scene in Psycho. But then, well, God, this showed more than Psycho did in regards to blades entering, for God's sake. But then you look back, and you see the movies that came before, and it's almost like, regardless of that whole angle with Psycho, this also kind of feels like, despite the fact that it's coming from a separate place, the dude that wrote the play, it feels like a product leading up to it of Hitchcock's other movies. Like, for instance, I talked about Rope comes to mind a lot, where it's just these people talking about this perfect murder in this one location with, you know, trying to really cut down on cuts as much as we can. We've got Suspicion in here, where it's the wife that realizes she cannot trust the husband, and how much that's going to, obviously it's the whole plot of Suspicion. We have to get to that point in Dial M for Murder, but there's still that whole you can't really trust the husband aspect. You can throw Rebecca in there as well. When there's just this real paranoia about the one that you love. Or family, if you want to throw Shadow of a Doubt into it. We're getting to reaching points now. But there is also, any of his one location ones you can bring in, like Lifeboat as well, you can throw him with Rope. And then obviously, Tennis Player. Immediately makes you think of Strangers on a Train, for sure. Like I said, some of those are a bit reaching, but still, in the long run, when you kind of look at it and the way it built up to this, it's almost like this kind of became a product of what he had built up to that point. But in a good way, in a good kind of effective way that kind of meshes all the different kind of styles and stories he had initially told, and like I said, would go on to tell as well. So, yes, and then eventually we get to this point when the whole point was to kill her, and then once it becomes, oh, she did it intentionally, says the cops, we're gonna go have her executed. And it's like this, we've already had one big-ass story turn with the fact that she kills him instead of the other way around, but now we have this moment where it's like, it could possibly happen anyway, and it's like this Shakespearean handling of circumstance that somehow gets her in this situation as well. And we have that on top of the whole Agatha Christie thing that's going on now. And that's what I was saying earlier about how it's like a reverse Hitchcock movie, to where it's like, instead of really, really, really building and then a murder takes place, the murder takes place and then we have tension to build, because there's the cops investigating, he's got to really try to cover his tracks, and the walls are closing in. But this all happens like really like deliberate and slowly. And yeah, that's when like we really get to watch the tension start in one place and then just really, really get there, because we think really this could have been he could have easily probably gotten away with this. But there were just so many tiny little things in there that just made themselves add up that ultimately we come to the conclusion that we do. And that's really what makes it so special. Obviously, to break this up, we have an intermission. I think this is easily the shortest movie I've ever seen with an intermission. It's an hour 45. I think it's about 50 or 55 minutes in or so when we get the intermission. Very interesting. And talking also about the way Hitchcock had to approach this. He was obviously basically made to make this in 3D. I don't really know why either. I don't know what they thought, what kind of effect they thought this was going to have, but I think it's pretty clear that the normal way is the way we're supposed to see it. I think that's just the, and I think it was like a kind of a dying thing back then too, like the Vincent Price movies had come and gone and all that, like House of Wax. So there was really nothing to gain from it anyway. I guess it was just a studio thing, I guess, which obviously we still see today. But there are also some of those great techniques in there. Obviously, there's the cameo, and it's to my understanding that yes, that is also Jimmy Stewart in that picture as well, which is cool. But then, and you have stuff like, just little details like Grace Kelly's clothes. How it's like at the start she's always wearing like these bright colors, and then by the end she's like literally wearing black, or something, or some gray that's very close to black. And so little progressions like that that kind of work alongside the tension that's building already, that kind of enhance it a little bit. So yes, that takes us to one of, I would say it's one of his most famous movies, easily one of his most famous titles. I don't know how many people that know the title could tell you what it's actually about. I could be totally underestimating people here, but it's also, I guess it's just not one that you really hear. I don't know, like I said, I know it's got a famous name, but I mean, when you think of stuff like Psycho and Vertigo and Rear Window and stuff like that, it does feel a bit like, I can't say minor Hitchcock, because minor Hitchcock is a totally different thing. Like I said, if you want to go way back, you have to go to like The Secret Agent, or that time he tried to make a romantic comedy with Mr. and Mrs. Smith. That stuff would be minor Hitchcock. Whereas this is somewhere to where it's like, I don't think it's up here with the greats, but it's lower, but it's not, you know, as I would say, minor Hitchcock. It's kind of in a middle ground right here, where it, honestly for me, it doesn't leave that much of a lasting impact. But, I mean, I've still seen it a few times, but yeah, but overall, I do appreciate it while I'm watching it, but I don't think it has the lasting impact that many of his other movies do, which I think would probably be the reason. Well, like I said, the title stands out, maybe the movie itself not as much lives up to that, so, yeah. I don't know. I had so many great things to say about Blood Simple, but for some reason there's a part of me that just kind of prefers Dial-In for Murder. Like, I can watch Dial-In for Murder, like, easily. Like, it's one of those ones where it's like, when you look at Hitchcock's setup, you think, like, when you watch Vertigo, there's just so many things that are, like, draining about it. And with Rear Window, it's like, there's all that build-up. Not that it doesn't work, but there's a lot of build-up to get what it is. Dial-In for Murder is like, if you just have a Hitchcock fix, but you don't want to invest too much, like, you know, mind-wise or time-wise for something longer, like North by Northwest. That's how you end up seeing Dial-In for Murder multiple times. And it's like, if you need that Hitchcock fix, then it's fine. I'd throw this and I Confess in that territory, the one with Montgomery Clift and Carl Malden. So, yes, so that's the way I kind of see that. And I do think Blood Simple really does kind of suffer in its kind of final moments. The climax is amazing, but everything between him disposing of Marty and getting to that climax is where it kind of gets a little muddled for me. But yeah, and we don't really have those muddled moments in Dial-In for Murder. It's just kind of a lack of a lasting impact is what holds it back a little bit. But that's not to say anything particularly damning about it. So yeah, that's what these are. I don't know, I'm just choosing these at random now. I don't know what the next one's going to be, but hopefully it's exciting. And obviously we've got a bunch of other stuff coming, whatever that is. I don't know. We'll just say nothing is planned. Nothing whatsoever. So, until something is planned, that's it.